Have you ever noticed how some people seem to chase love like they're hunting shadows in the dark? They leap from relationship to relationship, always searching, always hoping, yet never quite finding that deep connection they crave. They date the same type of person over and over, wondering why love feels so elusive, so painful, so incomplete. What if I told you that Carl Jung, one of the most profound minds in psychology, discovered that this endless search isn't really about finding love at all? What if the very act of desperately seeking love in others is actually the greatest barrier to receiving it? Jung spent decades studying the human psyche, and he uncovered something revolutionary about love and relationships. He found that when we're constantly looking for love outside ourselves, we're actually projecting parts of our own psyche onto others, creating an illusion of connection that inevitably crumbles. But here's what's fascinating. There comes a moment in every person's journey when this pattern suddenly shifts. A moment when you stop looking for love in all the wrong places and begin attracting it from a completely different space within yourself. In the next few minutes, you're going to discover the 7 unmistakable signs that you've crossed this threshold. These aren't just behavioral changes. They're deep psychological shifts that Jung identified as markers of psychological maturity and authentic love readiness. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand not only whether you've reached this transformative stage, but also what it means for your future relationships and your connection to your own authentic self. The first sign that you've stopped looking for love in all the wrong places is perhaps the most profound. You no longer feel that gnawing emptiness when you're alone. Think about this for a moment. How many people do you know who can't stand their own company, who immediately reach for their phone when there's a moment of silence, who fill every evening with social plans, who panic at the thought of spending a weekend by themselves? Jung understood that this fear of solitude wasn't really about being alone. It was about being alone with the parts of ourselves we've rejected. When we're constantly seeking external validation and connection, we're actually running from an internal void that we believe only another person can fill. But here's the profound shift. When you've genuinely stopped looking for love in the wrong places, solitude becomes sacred. You begin to enjoy your own presence not as a consolation prize, but as a genuine source of fulfillment. This isn't about becoming a hermit or convincing yourself that you don't need others. It's about recognizing that your relationship with yourself is the foundation upon which all other relationships are built. When you can sit in silence without anxiety, when you can spend an evening alone without feeling incomplete, when your own thoughts become interesting company rather than something to escape from, this is when you've begun to heal the core wound that drives desperate love-seeking behavior. From Jung's perspective, this represents the beginning of what he called individuation, the process of becoming whole unto yourself. You're no longer looking for someone else to complete you because you're discovering that completion was always an inside job. The second sign reveals itself in how you respond to potential romantic interests. When you were looking for love in the wrong places, you likely found yourself immediately creating elaborate fantasies about new people you met. Within days or weeks, you'd constructed entire future scenarios, imagined how they might fit into your life, projected qualities onto them that you barely had evidence for. Jung identified this as a classic example of projection, unconsciously placing aspects of your inner world onto external people or situations. When we're desperately seeking love, we don't really see the person in front of us. Instead, we see what we need them to be, what we hope they might become, or what they represent to our unconscious mind. But when you've crossed this threshold, something remarkable happens. You begin to see people as they actually are, rather than as characters in your personal love story. You notice their actual behaviors, their real personality traits, their genuine compatibility with your authentic self, not the version of yourself you think you need to be to earn love. This shift represents a profound maturation of what Jung called the anima or animus, the contrasexual aspect of your psyche. Instead of projecting this inner figure onto every potential partner, you've begun to develop a conscious relationship with these aspects of yourself. You're no longer seeking someone to carry these projections because you've reclaimed them as part of your own psychological wholeness. The practical result is that your romantic interests become far more discerning, but also far more real. You're attracted to people for who they actually are, not for who you imagine they could become or what role you need them to play in your life's narrative. The third sign might surprise you because it seems counterintuitive. You become significantly less available to people who once would have consumed all your emotional energy. When you were looking for love in the wrong places, you probably found yourself drawn to complicated people, dramatic situations, relationships that required enormous amounts of effort just to maintain basic stability. Jung understood that this pattern often stems from what he called repetition compulsion, unconsciously recreating familiar dynamics from our earliest relationships, even when those dynamics were painful or unhealthy. If your early experiences of love were inconsistent, anxiety-provoking, or conditional, your unconscious mind might interpret those same qualities in adult relationships as love. But when you've stopped looking for love in the wrong places, you begin to recognize these patterns for what they are. You stop being attracted to people who need to be rescued, convinced, or constantly reassured of your worth. You no longer mistake intensity for intimacy or drama for depth. This doesn't mean you become cold or uncaring. Rather, you develop what Jung would call differentiation, the ability to maintain your own psychological boundaries while still being genuinely loving and supportive. You realize that being constantly available to someone else's emotional chaos isn't love. It's often a form of codependency that prevents both people from growing into their authentic selves. When you embody this sign, you naturally begin attracting people who are also emotionally stable and self-aware. Your energy is no longer scattered across multiple complicated relationships, so you have more genuine availability for connections that are truly nourishing and reciprocal. The fourth sign manifests in your relationship with your own standards and non-negotiables. When you were looking for love in the wrong places, you probably found yourself compromising on things that were genuinely important to you. Perhaps you dated people whose values didn't align with yours, overlooked behaviors that made you uncomfortable, or convinced yourself that love meant accepting treatment that didn't truly honor your worth. Jung wrote extensively about the shadow, those aspects of ourselves and others that we prefer not to acknowledge. When we're desperately seeking love, we often ignore obvious red flags, because admitting them would mean facing the possibility of being alone again. We suppress our intuitive knowing about what we need and deserve because our fear of rejection is stronger than our commitment to our own well-being. But when you've crossed this threshold, something profound shifts in your relationship with your own boundaries. You begin to understand that your standards aren't obstacles to love. They're expressions of self-respect that actually attract healthier connections. You realize that compromising your core values doesn't make you more lovable. It makes you unavailable to people who would genuinely appreciate your authentic self. This isn't about becoming rigid or demanding perfection. It's about recognizing that you have inherent worth that doesn't need to be earned through self-sacrifice or people-pleasing. When you embody this sign, you naturally begin attracting people who not only respect your boundaries, but are actually drawn to the clarity and self-respect they represent. Jung understood that psychological health requires what he called holding the tension of opposites. You can be both loving and discerning, both open-hearted and protective of your energy, both vulnerable and strong. When you stop looking for love in the wrong places, you embody this paradox naturally. Here's something profound that happens during this transformation. And it's worth pausing to really absorb this insight. When you've stopped looking for love in the wrong places, your entire nervous system begins to regulate differently. You're no longer in a constant state of vigilance, scanning your environment for potential romantic opportunities or threats to existing connections. This shift in your internal state changes everything about how you move through the world and what you attract into your experience. The fifth sign is perhaps the most liberating. You stop trying to be the person you think someone else wants you to be. When you were looking for love in the wrong places, you probably found yourself constantly adjusting your personality, interests, opinions, even your appearance, hoping to become more attractive to whoever caught your attention. Jung identified this as the dominance of the persona, the mask we wear in social situations. When we're desperately seeking love, the persona often becomes so dominant that we lose touch with our authentic self entirely. We become skilled at reading what others seem to want and molding ourselves accordingly, but in the process, we create connections based on false pretenses. The tragedy of this pattern is that even when it works, even when someone falls for the version of yourself you've constructed, you can never fully relax into the relationship. Part of you always knows that they don't really know you, and you live with the constant anxiety that they might discover who you really are and leave. But when you've stopped looking for love in the wrong places, you begin to trust that your authentic self is worthy of love. You stop auditioning for relationships and start simply being yourself, allowing others to respond to your genuine energy rather than your carefully crafted image. This shift requires tremendous courage, because it means risking rejection based on who you actually are, rather than who you pretend to be. But Jung understood that this risk is actually the doorway to genuine intimacy. Only when two authentic selves meet can real love flourish. When you embody this sign, you discover something miraculous. The right people are actually more attracted to your authentic self than they ever were to your personas. You begin to understand that pretending to be someone else doesn't just attract the wrong people, it actively repels the right ones. The sixth sign reveals itself in how you interpret and respond to romantic disappointments. When you were looking for love in the wrong places, rejection felt like evidence of your fundamental unworthiness. A relationship ending confirmed your worst fears about yourself. Someone not being interested in you became proof that something was wrong with you. Jung understood that these interpretations often stem from what he called the inferior function, aspects of our personality that remain underdeveloped and therefore become sources of insecurity and projection. When our sense of worth depends entirely on external validation, every romantic disappointment becomes an existential crisis. But when you've crossed this threshold, your relationship with rejection transforms completely. You begin to understand that not every connection is meant to flourish, and that someone not being interested in you often has nothing to do with your worth as a person. You recognize that compatibility is complex and multifaceted, and that rejection is often simply information about mismatch rather than judgment about value. More profoundly, you begin to see romantic disappointments as protection rather than punishment. When someone who isn't right for you removes themselves from consideration, you understand that this creates space for connections that are more aligned with your authentic self and genuine needs. Jung wrote about the importance of what he called amor fati, love of fate. When you stop looking for love in the wrong places, you develop trust in the intelligence of your life's unfolding. You begin to see that every no from the wrong person is actually a yes to something better aligned with your highest good. This doesn't mean you become indifferent to romantic outcomes. Rather, you develop resilience and perspective that allows you to remain open-hearted even in the face of disappointment. You understand that your worth isn't determined by any single person's opinion of you, and this understanding creates a stability that is incredibly attractive to emotionally healthy people. Now we come to the seventh and most profound sign, and this is where Jung's deepest insights about love and consciousness converge. When you've truly stopped looking for love in all the wrong places, you begin to understand that love is not something you find or acquire, but something you are and express. This represents what Jung considered the highest stage of psychological development regarding relationships. Instead of seeking love as a commodity to be obtained from others, you recognize love as a state of being, to be cultivated within yourself and shared freely with the world. When you embody this understanding, everything about your approach to relationships changes. You're no longer asking, "How can I get this person to love me?" Instead, you're exploring, "How can I express love authentically in this connection?" You're not trying to extract feelings, validation, or security from others. You're offering your genuine care and attention as gifts, without attachment to specific outcomes. Jung understood that this shift represents the integration of what he called the self, the archetype of wholeness and completion that exists within every human being. When you connect with this deeper aspect of your psyche, you realize that you already contain everything you were seeking in others. Love becomes something you emanate rather than something you pursue. This doesn't mean you no longer desire partnership or intimate connection. Rather, your desire comes from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, from wanting to share your wholeness rather than seeking someone to complete you. You understand that the purpose of relationship is not to fill a void, but to provide a context for mutual growth, creative expression, and spiritual evolution. When you reach this stage, you naturally begin attracting people who are also operating from this level of consciousness. Your relationships become less about need and more about choice, less about healing old wounds and more about creating new possibilities, less about finding yourself and more about expressing yourself. The beautiful paradox that Jung identified is this: the moment you stop desperately seeking love, you become a magnet for authentic, nourishing connections. When you're no longer coming from a place of lack, you're able to recognize and attract abundance. When you're no longer trying to get love, you become someone who naturally gives love, and love flows toward those who give it freely. But perhaps most importantly, you discover that the love you were seeking outside yourself was always available within you. The connection you craved with another was always available in your relationship with your own soul. The acceptance you hoped to find was always waiting in your willingness to embrace your own authentic self. This is the ultimate sign that you've stopped looking for love in all the wrong places. You've found it in the only place it was ever really available, within the depths of your own being. And from this foundation of self-love and wholeness, you're finally ready to participate in the kind of conscious, mature love that Jung understood was the birthright of every human being who has completed the journey from seeking to being. Take a moment now to consider your own journey with love and relationships. As you reflect on these 7 signs, notice which ones resonate with your current experience and which ones point toward areas where you might still be growing. Remember that this isn't about judgment or comparison, it's about awareness and gentle self-assessment. Jung believed that consciousness was the greatest gift we could give to ourselves and to the world. When you stop looking for love in all the wrong places, you don't just transform your romantic life. You become a beacon for others who are ready to make the same journey from seeking to being, from emptiness to wholeness, from desperation to love. The path from unconscious seeking to conscious being is not always easy, but it is always worthwhile. Every step you take toward wholeness not only heals your own heart, but contributes to the healing of the collective human experience of love. In choosing to love yourself first and most completely, you give others permission to do the same. In refusing to settle for connections that diminish your light, you raise the standard for love itself. Your willingness to look within instead of constantly seeking without is not just a personal victory. It's a gift to every person whose life you'll touch, every relationship you'll participate in, and every heart that will be inspired by your example of what it looks like to love from a place of wholeness rather than need. The love you've been seeking has been waiting for you all along, not in another person, but in the depths of your own authentic being. And now that you're ready to receive it, everything changes.